You're listening to episode 198 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Gary Weber joins us to speak about Happiness Beyond Thought, a practical guide to awakening. Awakening. It's one of the top 3 bugaboos traditional Buddhism has when trying to find resonance with a contemporary, often Western meditator. But, as is often the case, what we mean may open doors to Buddhism where only walls existed before. And that's the challenge, contextualizing the Dharma while not losing the essence. Problem is, essence is as interpretive with Buddhism as it is with other religions. So, what does awakening mean to you? Gary Weber has been a scientist, military officer, senior executive in industry and academia, and is the author of the book Happiness Beyond Thought, a practical guide to awakening. He has practiced Zen meditation, yoga, and philosophy for more than 35 years. In 1998, after over 20,000 hours of various contemplative practices, his thoughts stopped, or very nearly so. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice breakfast assam. Our guest today is Gary Weber. Gary, thanks for being on the podcast.
Hi, good to be here.
So we last ran into each other at the Buddhist Geeks conference last year. And before we get into talking about your book, let's have you tell us a little bit about your background.
Background, professionally was trained as a empirical scientist, PhD. Went off from that into private industry as well as the national laboratories and managed a lot of R&D organizations in some big organizations and all kinds of research. A wife, 2 kids, Pennsylvania born, but traveled many, many places around the world.
And how did you first encounter meditative practices?
Well, I was in graduate school and I was coming down the hill into campus. And I had one of these moments where you just see all these thoughts racing in your mind and had a little step back and looked and said, this is really not okay. There has to be a better way to run our consciousness than this, because there was nothing good happening there, nothing terrible, but just nothing really useful happening. And it was draining my energy, gobbling up a lot of bandwidth. And so I was just, for whatever reason, impelled to go about a search trying to find out if it was possible to stop this endless blah blah in my mind. And so I set off to do that. And as I did, I was, this is bibliomancy now, where a book comes off the shelf and jumps into your hand. I was went to the university library and picked up many books. And I was reading one on sitting out for my lunch one day. And I happened to open it up, and the very top line of the page I opened up to was all beings are from the very beginning Buddhas. And for whatever reason, everything opened up. The world opened up to a whole new place for half an hour, 45 minutes. and a place I had never experienced or seen before, at least I wasn't aware that I had, without thoughts. And so it showed me that it was possible to enter places, get to places where there were not thoughts. And it's a beautiful place, at least in this experience it was. So I set about to try to get back to that, and I closed the book over. It was a book of poems, and it had Zen on the cover. And at the time, I couldn't even spell Zen. So I launched off into exploring this Zen thing, since this line had come out of a Zen book, and went off into many different parts of Zen. I ended up in Rinzai Zen, which is the asking questions koan type Zen. And as I've got into that deeper and deeper, it turns out that I really needed to do something so I could sit longer. I was not very flexible at the time. I was in pretty good shape, but not very flexible. So I set about trying to sit more comfortably, and I did a lot of yoga to be able to do that. And I also at the time got connected, hooked into yoga. And this was early, this was in the 70s. And I just explored every possible facet of yoga I could find, and I went deeply into Zen. And I came across the teachings of two people. One was Basui, who's a 14th century Zen monk, and Ramana Maharshi, who's a 20th century Advaita master from South India. And both of them said the same thing. You can stop these thoughts if you just inquire into this I, this egoic entity that is embedded in each thought that comes along, virtually. And you just keep asking, where am I, and when am I, and what is this, and am I this body? And just keep letting go of attachments, which all tag in for an I. So in doing that, eventually it took a long time, I was off about 25 years and about 20,000 hours of combined meditation and yoga, mostly meditation, 2/3, 1/3 probably. And the yoga I did would turn out to be very much meditative as well, so it almost added to 20,000 hours. And at the time, I was running a very large R&D group, about 1,000 people, 4 research labs, and about a $250 million budget. And going up into a yoga posture I had done many times before, thousands of times, literally, my thoughts just stopped. And that was a surprise to me. I was trying to get them to stop, but I didn't think they would just completely stop, and they stopped. And so along with that went the disappearance of self-referential desires and fears. And I went off to work that day, and I thought that surely people would notice that I had this dramatic change, abrupt change in my consciousness. But in fact, nobody noticed at all. There was no glow. There was no ethereal being. There was no
halo, no wings.
No halo, no wings, no, oh, get him out of here, he's too dangerous now. Nobody even noticed. But as we've discussed, as it turned out, it was actually functionally enhancing. I was better in my job after the page turned and the thoughts stopped than I had been before, just because I was in every meeting 100%. I was no place else. Most people in most meetings are only there a part of the time. And that was a big advantage. And I also wasn't losing all this bandwidth and energy to this never-ending narrative that just went on and on and on. So it turned out to be a very sweet place and a very productive place. Plus these thoughts, desires, and fears had just fallen away.
Did you find it surprising that that falling away you described was as intimately attached to that selfing, or was that something expected?
The great genius that Basui and Ramana Maharshi had was to look back at the subject, pay no attention to the objects of the world, the names and forms, as the Indians would say, and just go back and deconstruct this I. And so I went about doing that, and although I had read a lot about this, I was unprepared for exactly how it happened, how abrupt it was, and what went along with it. I had not known, even though I had read mountains of books, I was not really aware of what should be expected, and yet there it was unequivocal. And so I went off then and talked to my 2 Zen masters just to get them to check it off, and they did, to get, yes, further confirmation. In fact, this was what it was. There was not much doubt in my mind, but I was curious as to what they would say.
Tell me a little bit about that. I'm rather curious because one of the discussions we have often
on the boards is, okay, if someone has an awakening and there's been a fundamental change as you're describing it, how does someone from the outside see that? How does one verify that that's whatever we consider awakening, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But how does someone else verify that? How does one see it or measure it?
Well, the very good thing about Rinzai Zen is they have developed over a long time frame a investigatory protocol to see if people are awakened or not. And all the people who are asking the questions, traditionally, are awakened. They've been also passed down through the lineage of a long, long time. And their person that passed them was awakened, etc., all the way back to the first person who did Rinzai Zen. So there is this sense of a lineage of understanding that people have had themselves and tried to detect in others. There are lots of questions they can ask and lots of ways people carry themselves, the way they speak. And over the course of, they have a thing called Dokusan, which you go into and you're asked a question or questions. And usually you're just yelled at and dispatched and chased out of the...
Oh, that brings me back.
Oh, yes, and chased out of the Dokusan room. And sometimes the Roshi, depends which, I had one very strict Roshi. There's an encouragement stick that can be used to encourage you to try harder to solve this. Often a koan, which the traditional koan is like sound of one hand clapping or your parents' face before you were born or things like that. But this natural koan was something that they did not often use, but it's in their books. So they were well aware of what the results should be. They should be look like every time else they came through to be awakened. So they knew what to look for, and they had lots of ways to probe you and ask you different kinds of questions and see how you answered in a way that they could tell. It's much easier if the person has been awakened themselves, because then they really, there's a sense you can feel what there is underneath the answers.
So I guess one of the challenges that a newcomer to this and looking for a teacher and a guide in this is how they can distinguish between a good teacher who's had a sincere and genuine experience and teaches well. That's also a trait that they would need, from someone who's may have had an excellent awakening experience but might not be the best teacher, or might be a great teacher but isn't very far along the path. How would a beginner be able to help distinguish that for themselves?
Well, it's not easy. As we've seen in the Buddhist community, there are many people who were believed to be awakened who behaved not well, and some people who claim to be enlightened are not very good teachers. And conversely, some people who are not enlightened turn to be useful teachers, but they can only take you as far as they have gone themselves. It's not a good judge, as we know in the Buddhist community. It is not a good judge to guess from exterior behaviors. It's very easy, and people have learned how to do this. There's a great video out of a fellow who just set out to do nothing except delude people into believing he was enlightened.
In fact, I'm acquainted with his parents, and we'll be trying to get him on the podcast to talk about this. Yes, I ran into his parents at the scientific conference for the Center for Mindfulness last year.
Yeah, fascinating video, and he just proved how gullible we are. I mean, we know what we expect an enlightened person to look like, how their pacing of their words go, how they would hold themselves and dress and have hair and everything else. And so he just mimicked all of those. And before long, he had, as you know from the video, quite a following of people who believed he was a big enlightened person. So it's very difficult externally just to judge from what they're wearing, what their name is, or what their actions are. The best way is to hang out with them for a while, talk to other people, and try to see if his teaching works for you. At some level, you'll be able to feel eventually whether this person is valid or not. But many people have been fooled for a long time by teachers.
One cautionary note I would add to that is that for someone who is looking for a good teacher and that which works for them, is we also need to be careful of a spiritual cafeteria mode where we choose what we like rather than what is helpful, which may be hard and it may take us to difficult places before it actually brings us to some benefit that we weren't expecting.
Absolutely. I discourage just wild cafeteria shopping. There is so much stuff on the internet, and so much more is available now than there was when I started doing this practice, that it's very easy to get absorbed on YouTube or Facebook and spend your hours and hours and hours, and at the end of it, you have accomplished nothing and really learned nothing. But there are many people out there now, and caution is advised. Because you say you can very easily get led astray. And something else I'd look for is be careful if the person puts themselves far above you. If they are some superhuman being and they don't feel like they're on your level, not in a good way, but that they're asking you to really bow down to them in great subservience, I'd be wary of those situations. I also don't charge for my teaching, which I think is a useful thing. I know it bothers some people who need to charge. I don't need to charge, so I don't. But I don't, hold back other people and complain about them if they need to charge to feed themselves. But there are people around who are just raking in the money hand over fist, who I question their seriousness about the practice.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's one of the reasons that what we have here is freely available as well. And I appreciate that sincerity of your giving. Gary, let's switch a little bit over to Awakening itself and the book, Happiness Beyond Thought. You kind of crafted the final chapter into that title. You gave away the ending of the story. Here is the Beyond Thought part. Let's talk a little bit about what you mean by awakening and how Beyond Thought applies to that.
Well, for me, the thought is a problematic concept because we have very different ideas of what thoughts are. And there are different kinds and types of thoughts. Until you start looking at them like you look at a frog in your hand or something, you don't really understand thoughts, because there are the kind most of us have most of the time, which is this endless blah, 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 blah narrative. And if you look at those, you'll see that they're all I, me, my, and they're all about the past and future. So those, turns out we can get rid of those. We can stop those. And we can certainly change their pattern. We can change how hooked together they are, how sticky they are to each other, which is the problem. And if you focus on this deconstructing the I, we actually know the network in the brain which does this selfing operation that feeds into these self-referential thoughts. You can shut those down. That's what we're focusing on. I didn't know it at the time, but the other kinds of thoughts, the planning thoughts, like, how do I get to I-95 or something, that's unimpeded. In fact, I found that was enhanced. Problem solving, planning, non-emotionally charged, sticky stuff works much better because you aren't encumbered by this ocean of self-referential narrative, blah, blah. So you gain a lot of bandwidth back, a lot of energy back, and that's just the indicator. I mean, it really is all about deconstructing the I and getting rid of selfing and getting rid of attachments. But the self-referential narrative is the best indicator I found, and we all have one, of exactly how much I have to work on yet, where I'm still attached, where I'm still suffering. And as I get rid of those, I find that my suffering goes down as my attachments go down. So it's just the best DIY indicator, and I had to do most of my practice by myself because I was working full-time in big jobs and traveling a lot and had a wife and 2 kids. But having something that I could use myself minute to minute as a monitor of how I was doing, with my efforts yielding anything, that was why it was useful for me, an indicator. But it was not the goal per se, but it was the indicator of when the goal had been reached.
Yeah, it's good to have some sort of reference to give yourself an idea of, so not only what is this, but how am I doing?
Exactly. And I tried many, many things. Many different approaches are in the book, many different ways to go at this thing, because I found that as you begin digging into this I thing, it's very resistant to being thrown out. And it's very almost like an adversary, a clever, cunning adversary who will try to find ways to block a certain kind of incursion. And so you need other approaches to come around the backside and sneak in. If you try one inquiry question, it gets blocked, then try another one, or try a negation, or try an affirmation, or use chanting, or do yoga, or do breathing practices. There are lots of ways to do this thing, and whatever appeals to you really deeply, and you're deeply engaged with, is what you should try with. I agree with you, don't window shop, But if you can find the thing that really you want to do, and it usually speaks out to you, that's what I found to be most useful for folks. They may change later, but it's really important to get something that you feel hooks into you. Not so much you like it, but it feels like it hooks into you and it really does deeply engage you.
Yeah, the insidiousness, that Mara of self, that's the trickiest thing. I mean, there's a reason that traditions indicate that self is, in that sense, is rooted out last in a path to awakening, because it is so very insidious, and that's part of who we are. That's hardwired into our very biological makeup. You brought up something interesting, Gary, and I want us to explore that a little bit more. That there are a lot of different kinds of ways in which you can try different things in your exploration of contemplative practices and the things we do to help chip away at this self, at the ongoing stream of thought. And that's very refreshing, because I don't often hear the acknowledgement that we're very unique creatures in our backgrounds, in how we think, and the things that we value and where we put our weights. Tell us a little bit more about this individuality of practice, and why chanting might be great for one person, but not another, and that's okay.
Yes, I mean, I found the yoga that I did was immensely useful, because a lot of memories and such are apparently locked into different parts of the body-mind. And if you work with those, different things will get released. I mean, these are embodied fears and embodied stories, and so you can disembody them. But it requires, in my experience, engagement in some kind of a physical practice. It doesn't have to be yoga. And chanting was something I did not do much of, but I do a lot of it now. If you know how to use it, it's a very powerful practice with folk. They get into it very quickly. Sanskrit works best, in my experience, because it is phonically tuned. It is the root tongue of a lot of the Indo-European languages, in fact, most of them. But it does work very well. But just keep feeling around for what practice works, because Mara is running around trying to stamp out the current problem, and she may be successful. You may have to come around another direction. So I found it very important to have a broad kit of tools to work on this problem. I mean, if you just pick on mindfulness, if you just do one practice forever and ever and ever and ever, you may even wake up within the context of that particular understanding, but there are many other ways around that you need to solve as well to be fully awakened. It's not enough to be awakened just in one very thin slice.
Yeah, that's one reason that I also encourage people to shop around in their teachers and their practice, not for the spiritual cafeteria kinds of practice of find something you like that's easy. It's not that at all. Quite the opposite, it can be. But to first vet your teachers, get to know them, observe them in practice. Do they actually do what they're teaching their students to do? And even once you've found one person with whom you resonate, and that's great. And again, I want to stress that I'm a firm supporter of the idea of having a relationship with a teacher. And that can be a difficult place to get to. Totally understand. It's not always easy. That doesn't mean that you can't have more than one teacher in different practices that are really their purview, that they're best at. They do really well. You can learn from many people.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I have a video out on YouTube on what is a teacher, and you do find out that you may find a little niche from this teacher or something from this teacher. As much as you can, I agree. Develop a relationship, because there is something, and no one likes to talk about this, but there is something intangible. There's a transmission that can take place with some teachers that you can connect into. It's not intellectual, but you can feel a linkage with that person in a way that information may be getting passed some way that is not just intellectual.
Not just verbal. Yeah, it's a difficult topic for us because we tend to shy away from things we can't pin down as well, that we can't measure as well. And I am a mechanist. I do believe in the scientific method. That's not from a spiritual belief, but from an understanding of, hey, this tends to work in describing the natural world. it doesn't mean that our complexity as individuals and how we communicate and how we relate and the subtle nuances of that isn't something that we can't represent just as a referential way of a transmission. We don't mean that has to be a magical thing where people are levitating and there are shiny lights.
No, but I think it's important also to realize, for me, I try to get people into tactile sensations for this eye. I mean, you can actually train people to feel, get out of your intellect and just kind of feel where this attachment is, feel where this eye is. What's it feel like when the eye is there, when the eye isn't there? Because it isn't there all the time. And as they begin to feel that, then they can DIY their way into a lot of stuff just by sensing that, oh, this practice is working because I can feel when I do it, this attachment goes away. It's just hard to talk about, but it really is get you out of your head into your body, into your sensing, your feeling of what's going on inside your consciousness. It's a very powerful tool.
Gary, I also wanted to talk about another book of yours for just a moment, Dancing Beyond Thought, Bhagavad Gita Verses and Dialogues on Awakening. Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
I did not have any spiritual text that I worked with while I went through my practices until the page turned. And I was not drawn to the Bhagavad Gita, and I did not learn Sanskrit or anything. I refused to learn it. And then I found myself, after the page turned, I was looking for some kind of a wisdom tradition that might be able to intellectually describe what was going through my consciousness. My consciousness was experientially minute by minute. And I kept searching around, and I came upon Advaita Vedanta, which I had not studied at all philosophically. I hadn't used any philosophy. And that turned out to be very useful. One of the most useful books in that was Bhagavad Gita. And I went around and found a bunch of verses that worked for me. Ramana Maharshi had recommended a bunch. And I put those into a book, and there's a YouTube video of my chanting the 60 verses in the book. And these are 60 verses, most of which Ramana had picked out. It's a world-renowned wisdom tradition and embodied in one book that's been very powerful for many people, not just in India, but many people across history. Europe and the United States have found great value in this text. Great psychological text and a great embodiment of practices.
Well, for folks listening to the podcast, I will be linking both books on the episode page for this episode, as well as Gary's website, happinessbeyondthought.com, and there are dashes in between each word there. Our guest today, Gary Weber. Gary, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Ted. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.